Fantastiskt att det kommer så mycket folk. Det finns hopp om mänskligheten. Det här är en helt ny roll för mig. Jag har alltså blivit intervjuad i hela mitt vuxna liv sedan jag var 18 år och nu är jag 70. Och det här är första gången någonsin som jag ska intervjua någon annan. Och inte vem som helst. En extremt intervjuad person är ju naturligtvis Richard Dawkins. Och han har hört extremt mycket dumma frågor, det är jag säker på. Det har jag också. Jag ska försöka undvika dem ikväll. Han behöver ju inte någon vidare presentation, vår gäst. Så det är bara att köra på. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Richard Dawkins. What a welcome.
Thank you.
Like a pop concert, isn't it?
Does my microphone work?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Welcome to the...
I can't see, it's all dark out there, but I presume there's quite a lot of people out
I
there.
assure you, there are 1,700 people here.
Hi.
Tonight.
Okay.
Yeah. So, welcome to the Circus Theatre.
Thank you.
And on this very stage tonight, there will be a musical performed. And the main character is, I think, the most famous religious woman in Swedish literature. And it's based on a story by the most famous atheist author in Swedish literature. So that's fantastic. And I wrote those lyrics that you just heard. You're here for the Nobel dinner primarily. I saw
No,
you
I'm
there
here
the
for
other
this.
day.
I'm here for this event.
Of course.
But I was privileged to be invited to the Nobel Prize-giving ceremony and the dinner.
What was that like?
It was amazing. It was wonderful. I hadn't realized that Swedes are such sticklers for tradition and for a protocol. Things like you're not allowed to wear a wristwatch.
You're not?
No. You
Why?
didn't know that? Well, it goes against custom. It goes against the
Fantastic, and they
You're
follow
allowed to
those
wear
rules.
a pocket watch with a gold chain.
Of course, yes.
But not a wristwatch.
And you were seated together with interesting people?
Yes, indeed. My escort was Christina Moberg, who's the president of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. I was very honored to be escorted by her. And she conducted me through it. I would have got very lost without her. But I loved all the trumpets playing fanfares and the speeches. And
yes, it's very special, isn't it?
Very special.
Yeah.
Yes.
But you're also here to promote the second installment of your memoirs.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. The first installment came out 2 years ago, and I did in fact come here to promote that. And the second installment is, I see up here, good. Yes, it came out in Britain a couple of months ago. And I suspect the Swedish translation may be the first of the foreign translations to come out.
I think so.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Yes, great.
Although I'm not entirely sure why you bother, because I haven't met a single person in Sweden who doesn't talk English.
Stephen Fry begins the third installment of his memoirs this way. There is nothing very appealing about show business memoirs. And I kind of know what he means. I do understand. But with someone like you, it's an entirely different story, I think. Because where we don't need to inspire young people to become pop stars, we need to inspire them to become scientists. And I think your memoirs are such an inspiration. Is that why you wrote them, or did you want to go down memory lane again?
Well, I hadn't thought of that, but that's a much better reason than the one you've just
Isn't it?
given me. Yes, inspire young people to treat science in the same way as they treat pop singers. That will be right, yeah. because science is exciting and inspiring.
It is.
Yes.
But it seems to me young people don't quite get that.
Yes, they do.
Do they?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. I've seen you on Bill Mayer and other shows talking about your book. Are you asked the same questions over and over again?
There is a certain tendency in that direction. I'm being very tactful now because I'm not quite sure what you're going to ask me next.
I am very curious to know.
Okay.
Well, which is, I know what mine is, which is your most common question?
Oh, my most common question is, what's going to happen in human evolution next?
Okay. So I cross out that one.
Don't ask me that.
I cross that out. And what is the dumbest question you've ever had? Do you have a favorite?
What if you're wrong?
That's wonderful. Great. And do you see yourself foremost as a scientist or author today?
I like to think of myself as a scientist. I suppose it's true that I haven't put on a white lab coat for quite some years. But I like to think that my books on science for a lay audience are also contributions to science, that they also are read by professional scientists. I think they are. And I think that there is a place for writing in a way which appeals to both the lay audience and the professional audience. I think the exercise of writing for lay people helps to clarify your own thoughts so that you understand it better yourself, and that possibly helps other scientists to understand it as well.
Yeah, and that's probably why they have chosen me as an interviewer today. But you've had, and you have a fantastic scientific career, and you've written, several bestsellers. What makes you tick today?
Pretty much the same as always did. I mean, I don't feel older than about 22 at the moment. So I think what makes me tick is still science and the curiosity to understand the world, to understand the universe, to understand life by reading and talking and trying to convey it to other people. I think that is still what makes me tick.
You gave an extremely fascinating, I thought, TED talk some years back, where you talked about the middle world and the queerness of the macro and microcosmoses.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I'd forgotten all about that. The title, I think, was taken from J.B.S. Haldane, the great British biologist, who said, "Now my suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose." And in those days, queer meant queer. It didn't mean...
Yes.
And I think... I think he went on, I suspect that there are more things... he was quoting Hamlet, quoting Shakespeare. Not only more things that are dreamt of in your philosophy, that more things that can be dreamt of in any philosophy. And I think he meant that the universe is going to be so mysterious that the human mind is going to have a hard time understanding it.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's remarkable that the human brain, which was naturally selected to survive on the African savanna, hunting and gathering, finding a mate, finding water holes, finding a place to camp for the night, avoiding being eaten by lions, that the brain which was evolved for that purpose finds nowadays it can do the kinds of things which your previous two speakers this afternoon could do. Could do quantum theory, could do relativity, can do science, can do poetry, can do music. Isn't it a remarkable thing that the human brain can do that, even though it was selected simply to survive in Africa as an ape.
Yeah.
Well, I went on in my lecture to talk about what I called middle world, which you've just mentioned. Middle world is the world which we will evolve to survive in, the world of medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds, which means not relativity, which is objects moving at near the speed of light or at the speed of light, and not quantum theory, which is objects not just smaller than we're used to dealing with, but enormous orders of magnitude smaller than we're used to be dealing with. And our brains are not equipped to understand the mysteries of quantum theory. We can only do it by metaphor, by doing the mathematics, by making predictions which can be tested in middle world. And I just think it's a remarkable faculty of the human mind to be capable of moving out of middle world, both into the world of the very fast and large, the cosmics domain, and the quantum domain.
Yes. And do you think that the human brain can evolve further?
I don't know that it will evolve further, but it seems to be able to, or not by biological evolution, but by cultural evolution. We are, as Newton said, standing on the shoulders of giants. I gave a lecture called the Richard Dimbleby Lecture on BBC television, in which I began with the words, "You could give Aristotle a tutorial and thrill him to the core of his being." And the point is that Aristotle may be one of the most intelligent people who've ever lived, but he was bone ignorant compared to the merest child today, who has been educated in science post-Galileo, post-Newton, post-Darwin, post-Planck, post-Watson and Crick, etc. So it is a privilege to be standing on the shoulders of giants and to have accumulated the evolved knowledge. Our brains haven't evolved, but the knowledge that we put into them has. And that's going to go on. And I think that's exciting. I mean, whether the brain itself will evolve, that's a much more difficult question. Indeed, that's the most common question I get asked, as I told you. But human knowledge, the human intellect, what we use our brains for, is evolving extremely fast all the time.
And this queerness on both sides, sort of the middle world, what does that do to the theory of everything? Is it kind of slipping away from us?
I don't know. I think that may be partly what Max and Ulf were talking about. But
they might have talked about that, yes.
I don't speak Swedish, so I don't know what they were talking about. But I think it is an open question which physicists differ about, whether there will be a theory of everything which will bring physics to an end. And that's perfectly possible, or the opposite may be perfectly possible. It may be that every time you think you've got to the end, new vistas open up.
Yes.
And I don't know what I think about that. In a way, I find both prospects equally exciting. I mean, I'm very excited by the thought that science may reach, physics at least, may reach a kind of nirvana of satisfied, soporific.
Yes, I was coming to that. Yeah. Einstein is quoted as saying, "The more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know." And however depressing would it be true to say that the further science advances, the wider the scope for things it realizes that it cannot explain.
Yes, yeah. Well, I don't know, and I'm, as I say, equally excited by both prospects.
You say in that TED talk that whatever we are not the stuff we're made of. In your view, what are we?
I've forgotten I said that. Maybe was I quoting somebody else when I said that? Maybe what I meant was something like the distinction between hardware and software. That the hardware of a computer is not the software that actually when it plays chess or something of that sort. It's all done on hardware.
I think what you were talking about was the fact that the atoms that is in the body of Richard Dawkins now are not the same atoms as before.
Right. Now that's very interesting.
If none of those atoms are there, what are we?
That's very interesting.
Yes. I think so
yet,
too.
You know, as it happened, I was discussing this with my neighbor on the other side at the Nobel dinner, because she was a very charming young woman who was completely covered with tattoos. And I started thinking, all that stuff about the atoms that we are now, we're not going to be in 20 years' time. How come tattoos last in that case?
Yes. That's a good question, isn't it?
Isn't that a good question?
Yeah.
So okay. I think it may not be quite true.
Most scientists today, they subscribe to a mechanistic view of the mind. And we are the way because our brains are wired as they are. And we'd be different if our neuroanatomy was different. We know that, and yet we seem to forget that when we interact with each other with feelings, intuition, love and hate. Do you think, is there more to us than the mechanistic view supposes?
I can't see that dualism in the old-fashioned sense could possibly be right. I mean, I think it's got to be the case that that everything that we do and everything that we think and feel is done in the brain and depends upon the hardware of the brain. And yet, we all of us have an extremely powerful illusion of selfhood. And when we talk to each other, we think of the other person as being a soul, think of the other person as being a self. I think it's a useful illusion. It's an illusion that has been built into us by natural selection. There is nothing but brains, but the illusion of personal selfhood must have been valuable, must be valuable, and that's why we have it. Yeah. And it is such a powerful illusion that I think everybody else, including the most dyed-in-the-wool mechanist, actually sort of in their heart of heart.
Yeah, you sort of live as though
you live as though you are a soul.
Yeah. Which brings me to consciousness and self-consciousness, the unsolved mysteries. Did they appear at a certain point in evolution, and how? Why, do you think?
When consciousness arose?
Yes.
Yes. The whole message you get from evolution is that things don't happen suddenly. They happen gradually. And so I would be inclined to think that consciousness is not something that suddenly switched on in some particular ancestor, but gradually came into being. Rather as when you're coming round from a deep sleep or coming round from an anesthetic, and you dimly perceive, and then things become clearer. I think it would probably be more like that. It may be that there were certain landmark changes, perhaps the origin of language. It's hard to quite imagine what self-consciousness would be like without language to express thoughts. I certainly think that non-linguistic species have consciousness of a kind, but I think it may be that there was a sort of leap forward in consciousness when language came into being. And although as an orthodox Darwinian, I would expect that language, like everything else, evolved gradually, language could be one exception. It's conceivable that language did arise suddenly. And the reason for thinking that is that, lots of species communicate in all sorts of ways, but they don't put together grammatical sentences like all human languages have, with relative clauses and prepositional clauses, and above all, clauses hierarchically embedded within other clauses. I once wrote a computer program to generate correct grammatical sentences. It didn't have any vocabulary, but it could do grammar. And it was built based on Chomskyan principles. And I remember one sentence that it composed. It went, the adjective noun of the adjective noun, which adverbly verbed in noun of the noun which verbed, adverbly verbed. Now, that is a correct English sentence, although it doesn't mean anything, but it's grammatically correct, and every bracket is correctly rounded off.
Oh, really?
Every bracket that's opened, you'll find it's closed somewhere. Now, that does seem to be a uniquely human feature.
Yes.
No other animal communication system has that property of self-embedded clauses.
No.
And if you look in computer languages, the earliest computer languages that ran on big mainframe computers, like Fortran, couldn't do that. They didn't have what computer scientists call recursion. Recursion came in later languages, and it had to be invented. It suddenly came. A language either has recursion or it doesn't. A computer language either has recursion or it doesn't. Well, that's an all or none thing. You can't have half recursion. And so whenever it was that the human brain acquired the ability to do recursive embedding like that, that does seem to be a sudden event. And the first human who could do that had nobody to talk to.
Isn't that a sad thought?
So that's a bit of a mystery. But if we set that on one side, that awkward little pointer at one side, perhaps it suggests that something very sudden happened in the evolution of human language, and it may be that that was a moment when a light got switched on.
Yes.
In consciousness.
Yes, right. And consciousness explained what is the most promising lead now, do you think? Has anything happened lately?
I don't know. I mean, it's called the hard problem.
Yeah.
And you can see why. I mean, I've read Dan Dennett's book, and his is called Consciousness Explained. I can't explain consciousness.
No, nobody can. But are we any closer, do you think, to answering the question of how life originated on Earth?
Oh, well, that's a very interesting question. It's another difficult question. I think it's true to say that we know the kind of thing that it had to be. We know that a major breakthrough was when the first self-replicating molecule came into existence. Like DNA, it wasn't DNA. DNA requires protein in order to do it. But there must have been a forerunner, a John the Baptist to DNA, so to speak. There must have been a forerunner which had the capacity to self-replicate, a molecule which arose by random luck, in chemical luck in the primeval soup, whatever that was. And once that happened, once you had self-replication, then you had the opportunity for some kind of Darwinian selection to get going. And once you got Darwinian selection going, then the whole pageant took off. And at some point, DNA moved in as the usurper, in a way, of the original self-replicator. Not just DNA, but the sort of partnership between DNA and protein. Protein is the executive family of molecules which actually does the work of biology, and DNA directs it. And that partnership must have got going a bit after the origin of life. The most fashionable theory at the moment is so-called RNA world theory. RNA is like DNA. It can replicate like DNA, but it can also do what protein does, which is enzyme catalysis. And so it's possible that what happened was that RNA started it all off, doing both jobs, both the replication job and the executive enzyme job. And then later, DNA took over the replication function and protein took over the enzyme function. So that's a current vogue theory, which sounds promising to me.
A few years back, you wrote a letter to Prince Charles about GMO,
Yes.
genetically modified organisms.
Yes.
I've Googled, and it began, "Sir, I think you may have an exaggerated idea of the naturalness of traditional or organic agriculture. Agriculture has always been unnatural." What was that about?
Prince Charles is a great enthusiast for natural organic foods, natural methods in agriculture, no artificial fertilizer, etc. And I was brought up on a farm rather like that, actually. Prince Charles has a rather mystical view of the world. He talks about things like the wind rustling through the trees, as though there's some kind of spiritual, druidic fantasy going on there. And there's a sort of anti-scientific spirit going on there. When I said that agriculture has always been unnatural, I think I meant that we were hunter-gatherers. That's our natural state. And when we moved into villages and then towns and started cultivating crops and domesticating animals, crops like wheat and maize are thoroughly unnatural crops. So although the health food stores have good stone ground wheat and things, this is very, very unnatural. So I don't remember exactly the details of my letter to Prince Charles. I do remember that he never replied.
People mean different things when they say natural world, don't they?
Yes.
What's your definition?
Well, I'd rather not be too precise. In my letter to Prince Charles, what I obviously must have meant was natural in the sense of what we were evolved to do before we started doing artificial things. But breeding wheat and breeding maize and breeding cows and breeding pigs is artificial. It's done by artificial selection. And so artificial selection has been a part of agriculture for millennia. What Prince Charles would mean by unnatural would be things like genetically modified modifying the genes, which is taking the other half of the Darwinian equation. Darwinism, you know, is random mutation followed by non-random survival, not non-random selection. Artificial selection, breeding cows and wheat, artificial selection is taking the selection part of the Darwinian equation and doing it artificially. Genetic modification is taking the mutation part of Darwinism and doing that artificially.
I read an article a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times about the new search replace tools of gene editing, where you can swap whatever you want in a genome and swap it for something else. So in this case, there was cattle that had horns that shouldn't have horns, so they swapped those genes. And it seems so very easy all of a sudden, and the implications are mind-boggling, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, yes. Well, that's just the kind of thing Prince Charles wouldn't like. And I think we have to exercise what's called the precautionary principle. I mean, whenever you move into uncharted waters and new territory in science, you've got to be a little bit careful to think what the long-term implications might be. But as a scientist, I can't help being excited at the thought of swapping genes in. It's an aspect of another thing that I find exciting, which is that genetics has, post-Watson and Crick, has become a branch of information technology.
Yes.
And nobody would have ever dreamed that. You can treat genes just as you would treat your Microsoft Word document, where you copy or cut a bit of text and paste it in somewhere else.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an amazing thing you can do. And not just from one breed of cattle to another, but from, I don't know, jellyfish to cats or something like that. I mean, because we all have the same genetic code.
Yeah.
And therefore, it literally is possible to cut a gene out of one organism and paste it into an organism that is totally unrelated to it, like a cat and a jellyfish.
And that will pass it on to subsequent generations.
Yes. And that means that it is something you've got to be a bit frightened of, because putting these things into subsequent generations is something that's never been done before, and you want to think about that.
And this gene editing plus artificial intelligence, is evolution going into fast forward? What is happening?
Well, yes. It's already pretty fast. It's going even faster. And some people, serious scientists like Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk, are seriously worried about the long-term prospects of artificial intelligence. Nobody knows where that will end, and whether humans may be subject to a usurping takeover the way the first replicator was by DNA.
But those things are of the natural world, so they are evolution, aren't they?
In a sense, they are, yes. But if you come back in a few thousand years' time and find that the only humans around are actually made of metal and silicon, and they may have some kind of ancient historical myth about a dawn age when there were soft, squishy things but based on carbon and water. Some people are very frightened by that thought.
It seems that few ideas present more of a challenge to majority of religious people than the theory of evolution. It's as though science makes an intrusion into the realm of traditionally for philosophy and religion. How can science help us answer existential questions?
Well, if science can't help us answer them, then nothing else can.
No.
So I think it's a mistake to say that questions like, what is the purpose of life? What's it all about? Why are we here? Or very deep questions like, where do the laws of nature originally come from? It is certainly arguable that science cannot answer very deep questions like that. But it's a logical fallacy to say, because science can't answer them, therefore religion can. Just because religion says it can, that doesn't mean anything at all. I mean, let's take some of those existential questions. I mean, what is the meaning of life? Well, you can answer that in various ways. You can say, each one of us can make our own meaning in life, and that can be very different for different people. Or you can say, the ultimate biological meaning of life is something to do with gene survival, and I've said that in several of my books. But of course, I also have personal meaning in my life as well. Where do the laws of physics come from? Well, nobody knows that, and it may be we shall never know. But if we ever know, it won't be religion that tells us. It'll be something else.
Yeah. I've been interested and fascinated by religion for as long as I can remember. But the wake-up call was 9/11, when I suddenly realized that we take a secular society for granted. What's your story with religion? Did you grow up with it, or when did you become interested?
Well, I suppose 9/11 was a wake-up call with respect to realizing what damage religion can do. But
Yeah.
it wasn't a wake-up call, I suspect not for you either, with, when we're talking about why we don't believe in religion. I mean, it might have been a wake-up call with respect to why we want to stand up and fight it,
Yes.
but not why we don't believe it. For me, why I don't believe it, my wake-up call, I suppose, was when I first understood Darwinism, when I first understood that, the prodigious complexity and elegance and beauty of the living world, amazingly, has an explanation, a very satisfying explanation, purely scientific, purely naturalistic, starting from simple primordia. Before I understood that, I fell for the facile and actually deeply unsatisfying explanation that there must have been a designer. That, of course, is unsatisfying because it doesn't explain where the designer came from. It just pushes the question back one step to a not very impressive place.
Certain people seem to be able to, even though they're highly intelligent scientists, that they bypass the part of the brain that says you need good reason to believe something to be true. Could there be physical differences in the brain? Some people are more musically talented than others, and in the same way, could some people be more predisposed to...
It's very hard to understand, isn't it? There are even people who can actually in the same brain, hold evidently, obviously, manifestly contradictory beliefs.
Yes.
The most extreme example I know, I can't name, I probably shouldn't name the name anyway, I was told this by the professor of astronomy at Oxford. He said he had a colleague in America, an astrophysicist, who writes learned papers in astronomy, in astrophysics, mathematical papers, and his mathematical papers all assume that the universe is 13 billion years old, and yet he privately believes the universe is only 6,000 years old. Well, how can you have a brain that holds contradictory beliefs?
Yes, that's my question. How is it possible?
I don't think it is possible, and yet it happens.
Yet it happens.
Yeah.
So you don't think it's possible?
Well, I mean, I suppose he could be simply being dishonest. It could be that he really, really, really believes it's 6,000 years old, but he draws his salary as a professor of astrophysics.
Yes.
And he's got to write these papers, and he's got the mathematical skill to do it. And so he just tells himself what he thinks of as a falsehood, which is the universe is 13 billion years old, and then derives results by mathematics from that. But how anybody can live such a dishonest life, I don't know.
Incredible. But is human nature wired toward creating meaning where there is no meaning?
Well, I think it's human nature to look for meaning, and there very often is meaning, but there may not be an ultimate meaning.
No.
So people will sometimes mistakenly use the phrase meaning to mean, say, deliberate design or something of that sort. So they will say, oh, you mean to say that, that the whole of life evolves by natural selection, and therefore there is no meaning. Well, in one sense there's no meaning, but I think in another sense there is. And it's a meaning that scientists can tease apart and analyze, understand, and rejoice in.
Is religion a product of evolution? And in what way?
Well, religion is a product of brains, and it's found in, I think, all human cultures that anthropologists have looked at. So it does seem to be a kind of human universal, like sexual desire, heterosexual desire. Not every individual has heterosexual desire, but we still call it a human universal. Not every individual has religion, but it's probably fair to call it a human universal in the same kind of sense as heterosexual desire. Does it have Darwinian survival value? Well, it might have, or perhaps a better way to put that would be the psychological predispositions that lead to religion under some cultural circumstances, but might lead to something else under other circumstances. Maybe that's what has survival value. So our brains, our Darwinianly evolved brains, have a predisposition which often manifests itself as religion. Am I getting this across? I mean, is my English okay?
It's the King's or the Queen's English, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. I read an article in the New York Times as well, very good paper, that one. And the headline was, "Born to be conned." And I guess this is...
No, but was what?
Born to be conned. And by con men.
Yes.
Yes. And that's what the question about human nature, why toward creating meaning out of meaninglessness, comes from. But as a secular humanist, I don't think it's necessary for a human being to adhere to any belief system at all. But why can't we throw all ideologies overboard and continue just as free, open-minded and curious human beings? Why does that seem to be so impossible?
Yes, I suppose you could have an ideology that you would regard as a good ideology. Perhaps you wouldn't want to use the word ideology.
No, perhaps not,
that.
but you know what I mean.
Something like democratic socialism or something like that. I mean, you could call that an ideology, and that would not involve any supernatural postulates, but
no.
But you might regard that as something worth struggling for.
Yeah. In the present climate of political correctness, it seems that we have forgotten how funny religion is.
Yes. Yes.
You remember the days when Monty Python made fun of Jesus in The Life of Brian?
I think that may be the funniest film I've ever seen in my life.
Yes. But will we ever be able to joke about Mohammed?
Why the hell not?
Yeah. That's a movie I'd like to see. But who's going to make it? Who has the courage? But in the days of Monty Python, the freedom of expression included the right to offend.
Yes.
But since then, a culture has developed where people say, yes, freedom of speech by all means, but, you know.
Do you think, as somebody who knows show business very well, are you suggesting that Life of Brian couldn't be made today? Or is it still...
No, Life of Brian could still be made. But Life of Ali couldn't be made.
Exactly,
yeah.
Yes. Well, that's very unfortunate, of course, that sheer threat, a physical threat,
yes.
Makes it... But that wasn't... Your question was about political correctness, which is not about physical threat, but which is... You were talking about offense.
Yeah, I think this respect for... People want to respect other people's faith. And I find this kind of censorship.
Yes, I agree with you.
Very stifling.
Yes, I agree with you. I think that offence is a word that's being used much too much nowadays. And I think it's become almost a cliche to say that nobody has the right not to be offended. If somebody offends your belief, what you should do is stand up and argue for your belief. Don't just retreat behind the saying, "Oh, I'm offended. You must shut up." No, argue for why you're right.
And do you think that this political correctness affects science at all?
I hope not. I think that part of the problem is that some people identify with their beliefs. So if you attack their beliefs, they think you're attacking them. It's as though you've said they've got an ugly face or something like that. I'm very fond of quoting the British journalist Johann Hari, who says, I respect you as a person too much to respect your ridiculous beliefs.
Marx and Lenin, they could see religion for what it was, opium for the people. But how do you think, how come that those who are supposed to uphold Marx's legacy today see it completely different? Or at least they seem to.
I don't know much about Marx's legacy, actually. I'm not sure I can answer that.
I'll go on to the next question then.
Okay.
After Paris, as after all Islamist attacks, there was this, the politicians were harping the same, nothing to do with Islam mantra.
Yes.
What's your view on that? Does it?
Yes, a lot of people say that, and I think if you listen to the rhetoric of ISIS, they don't talk about anything else but religion. I mean, their whole discourse is entirely suffused with religion, with quoting from the Quran, quoting from the Hadith. They are utterly obsessed with religion. Their whole idea of the caliphate, their whole what they're trying to set up in Syria and in the Middle East, what they would like to conquer the world with, Sharia law. Of course, it has to do with religion. Now, the great misunderstanding is to say, because you say that, you're therefore accusing all Muslims of being supporters of these terrible things like beheading and stoning and throwing gay people off high buildings and things like that. People are not their beliefs. Many Muslims, of course, don't believe it anyway, and thank goodness for that. But even the ones who do, they are not their beliefs. They're nice, decent people who don't hold, who don't carry it out, who don't take it seriously. But ISIS, of all Muslims in the world, they are the ones who are taking their religion seriously.
Yes.
If only people wouldn't take their religion seriously. I mean, religion would be fine if only people wouldn't take it seriously. No.
And I suppose what makes it so serious is also that the Quran is supposed to be God's words, literally, God speaking to us. And when Allah actually says in the Quran, in Surah 9:5, I happen to know that, to kill the infidel, who will say that he didn't mean what he said? I mean,
that is the problem.
I find that very difficult to...
Because most Christian theologians today, anyway, do not take the Bible seriously.
No.
Any awkward verses, and there are quite a lot of them, they've turned them into metaphors. They're not very convincing metaphors of anything very nice, actually, but they get around it by turning them into metaphors. Yeah. But as far as I can tell, you can't do that with the Quran.
No.
Because, as you say, it is the literal word of God.
Yes. And Abul Hamid Abaoud, that's the guy who mastermind behind the Paris attacks. He wasn't poor, deprived, or marginalized. And neither was Muhammad Atta behind the 9/11, nor the couple in San Bernardino lately. They didn't come from poverty or social exclusion. And yet, politicians still seem to make it a social issue.
Yes.
When it's ideological, I think.
Yes. Yes, as you say, these are not poor people, and they're often educated. often educated in engineering, oddly enough. I wonder why that is.
And Abaoud, he urged Muslims to shake off a humiliating life in Europe and find pride and honor in their religion and jihad. And he was looking down on Westerners from a superior position. Isn't that fascism?
I think it is exactly fascism, yes. I actually interviewed for television one of these characters in Jerusalem, and he was advocating world domination by Islam. He said he expressed great admiration for Hitler, and that's not uncommon. Yes, I think it is a form of not just fascism, but extreme fascism.
And the Muslim world hasn't had its enlightenment or reformation. More and more people talk about that as the only way to counter Islamism.
Yes.
Well, would it even be possible, do you think?
Well, I mean, it would be nice to think so. I mean, two peoples I respect very much, Majid Nawaz and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, both either, I mean, Ayaan is an ex-Muslim, Majid still calls himself a Muslim, and both of them are pinning their hopes on a reformation of Islam. Historically, the Reformation of Christianity was the origin of Lutheran Christianity, wasn't it, rather than, as opposed to Catholicism. But you don't perhaps want that as a model. I think the Enlightenment might be a better model. But it's certainly pointed out often that Islam is several centuries behind, and it would be nice to sort of leap ahead those centuries.
Yeah. This time of the year, there's music. You hear a lot of music closely connected with the figure of Jesus. And when I hear Silent Night, Oh Holy Night, Ave Maria, it does conjure up images and feelings of peace and goodwill.
Yes.
Do you feel the same?
Very much so, yes. I mean, I am a cultural Christian, and so I warm to the sound of Christmas carols.
Yes.
And indeed the literature of the Bible. I don't know what the Bible is like in Swedish, but in 17th century English, it's pretty good stuff.
Yes.
It's
good stories.
It's not just good story, but I mean good literature, beautifully written, beautifully translated, and so that's part of my heritage. That's part of my culture, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate that other people in different religions will have the same feelings. So by all means, have the aesthetic and cultural traditions.
Yes.
But don't take it seriously.
But I lived in Henley-on-Thames for 6 years.
Yes.
That's between Oxford and London. And there are lots of little quaint villages and village churches. And I went to services like, for Christmas and things like that. And I always wondered to myself, I sat there watching, enjoying everything as though it was a show. And I wondered to myself, what if it was a show? Would we enjoy it as much if the priest was an actor who read a particularly good sermon and the congregation was an audience? Would we enjoy it as much?
Well, we enjoy reading fiction, which we know isn't real, and we even identify with the characters. We actually feel when a character in a novel falls in love with another character. We can kind of empathize with that. We can feel it. When a character in a novel dies, we can feel bereft.
Yes.
So yes, I see no problem with that. I just don't believe it's true, that's all.
No. Time flies, I think. At the end of the musical here tonight, Christina dies. And we're both at an age where that final horizon creeps closer. Do you think about death sometimes, or a lot?
Yes. I don't dread so much the prospect of being dead, because that'll be the same as not being born. And as Mark Twain said, I was dead for billions and billions of years before I was born, and never suffered the smallest inconvenience. So we were all dead through the time of the dinosaurs and the time of the trilobites and the time of early humans and so on. I don't relish the prospect of dying very much, partly because being a member of the unique species Homo sapiens, I'm not allowed to go to the vet and get myself put down.
No, I was coming to that.
Yeah.
It's hard to get a constructive debate going about euthanasia in this country. What's it like in the UK?
And that's partly because of religion as well, of course. So that's a problem. I mean, I do think that there is something quite frightening about the idea of eternity, the idea of just eternity going on and on and on and on and on. But again, eternity before you were born is just about as frightening as eternity after you're dead. And to the extent that eternity is frightening, I think I want to spend eternity under a general anesthetic. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Because when you're dead, of course, you are anesthetized. You don't know about it.
I happened to watch yesterday a movie about medieval knights. And they lived by codes of honor, and they swore oaths to die for king and country and religion and so forth. And people have died through the centuries for these reasons. And I wonder, apart from defending the lives of our loved ones, what is there to die for today?
Yes. Well, I think, I mean, the nearest I could come to that would be dying to preserve truth, something like scientific truth or something like that. I value what humanity has achieved, not just in science, but in literature and music and things as well. I do think there's something sad about the prospect that there will come a time when not a single entity anywhere in the universe will know anything about Shakespeare or Mozart. And so if the circumstance arose whereby I was asked to die for the preservation of human culture, I think I could imagine, including scientific culture, I think I could imagine that would be as close as I'd get.
Yeah.
Dying in warfare, yeah, I guess I could have gone to war against the Nazis.
Yeah.
And I feel that our generation is extremely fortunate not to have been called upon to do that. But it would have been hard to turn down. I certainly would not have died in the First World War. I'd have been a conscientious objector of the First World War for sure.
Yeah, such a waste. Incredible.
But in the Second World War, I think I probably would have.
Well, it's over an hour. Time flies. Extremely interesting and fascinating chat. I have a few questions from I think we have time for a few questions from the audience.
Right.
That we've had by email. One is, during the past 150 years, in what way has evolution theory evolved?
Oh, well, right. The big change, I think, came about in the 1930s when Mendelian genetics, the genetics of Gregor Mendel, was grafted onto Darwinism. So for Darwin, He talked about survival of the fittest. He talked about the individual striving to survive and reproduce. And he was clear enough that that only worked because there was some kind of heredity. But when Mendelian genetics was introduced in the 1930s, when Mendelian genetics was rediscovered in 1900, but then it wasn't actually put into Darwinism until the 1920s and 30s. And then Darwinism became a theory of changes in gene frequencies in populations. That was actually a big change. That would have quite surprised Darwin, I think. So when we talk about evolutionary change, we actually mean that genes, which are things you can count, they're digital, you can count them, that some of them become more frequent in the population and others become less frequent in the population. So that was a major evolutionary step in the evolution of evolutionary theory. There were other major steps in the 1960s, 70s, where, yeah, that was not so important, but that was an extension of the ideas from the 1930s. Then in parallel to that, from the 1950s onwards, genetics became digital in the sense of the actual molecular structure of a gene. The Watson and Crick gene is just a long string of computer tape. And that has hugely changed the way we think about evolution. We can now actually compare any two animals you like, or any two plants and animals you like, and actually look at the digital sequence of code letters in their genes, count the number of differences between them, literally count them, and compute how closely related they are, and even calculate how long ago their shared ancestor lived. And that's a huge advance, a huge advance when molecular biology became digital. I probably left something important out, but anyway, that's that question.
In your scientific career, what have you changed your mind about? Is there something
Is that the next question?
That's the next question.
Okay. I changed my mind about something called the handicap principle, which is, it mostly arose in sexual selection. Darwin's other theory, sexual selection, the peacock's tail theory. The peacock has this gorgeous fan because the peahen likes the look of it. There is a theory called the handicap theory, which suggests that the reason why not just peacock fans, but sexually selected characters generally are favored by females is that they are handicaps. Everybody knew they were handicaps, but the handicap principle idea was that the reason why a particular sexually selected character is favored is precisely that it's a handicap. And in a way, the female is saying to herself, this male has managed to survive in spite of carting around this ridiculous advertisement. So he must be a pretty good male.
Yes.
That's putting it very colloquially indeed, and I was extremely and vocally skeptical of that in the first edition of The Selfish Gene, my first book. And I was converted to accept a more mathematical version of the handicap principle by a student of mine, Alan Graffan, who produced a most brilliant mathematical model to show that the handicap principle can actually be made to work. It originated from an Israeli zoologist called Zahavi, who didn't do it mathematically.
And you happily changed your mind?
Yes, and so in the second edition of The Selfish Gene, I explain Graffan's model of the handicap principle and eat humble pie for having doubted it in the first edition.
Third question, would a medieval society have worked without religion? Was there a pre-scientific time where religion was good for the world?
Well, that's very interesting. I'm not a historian, obviously, and it's very clear that medieval society was obsessed with religion, and I could easily imagine a historian making a serious case that it needed religion to work. And I don't think I could comment on that as a scientist now.
And of the proofs of God's existence that you get from religious people, which one is the most credible, do you think? Which is the best?
I have to be careful here, because when I've been asked that before, and I've answered which is the most credible, people have then said, you believe in that one then?
Yes.
So I think that they are all incredible. I think they're all bad arguments, every one of them. But some are not quite so bad as others. And I've got that absolutely clear now. The least incredible one would be an argument from a physicist, perhaps, who said that the universe, the laws of the universe, the fundamental constants of the universe appear to be fine-tuned in such a way that if any of them were slightly different, the universe as we know it wouldn't exist, and in particular, we wouldn't exist, life wouldn't exist. Now, I think that's a bad argument, but it's the one that one can spend most time having an interesting argument about. But please don't go away and say that I believe it. I've been caught like that before.
Maybe Max and Ulf had an explanation for that earlier. We don't know that. Well, thank you very much for an extremely interesting and fascinating chat with you, Richard. Time went too fast.
Indeed, yes. And well, thank you very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much.